David Kenyon Webster, an English major from Harvard, did not volunteer out of blind patriotism. His motivation was primarily literary. He was a chronicler, driven by the desire to experience and record the visceral reality of modern combat firsthand. This pursuit was profoundly influenced by the searing honesty of World War I literature. He sought the crucible of the parachute infantry precisely because he knew shared misery would forge an unparalleled bond. He would later describe this connection as a mystical concoction, making his comrades closer than family. This was the core thesis of his journey, that war, while brutal, created an unparalleled human ecstasy born of shared life-or-death stakes. His path began unceremoniously in September 1943. He arrived in England on the old grey Samaria, an entrance that shattered any lingering childhood fantasies. As anticipation for the invasion built in the spring of 1944, the move to the marshalling area became an agonizing psychological compression. Webster characterized this period as the last 5 days in the death house. It was a time dominated by the tyranny of the present, where past and future vanished under the constant immediate threat of death. Soldiers, crammed into tents, saw their tension give way to pathological boredom. The journey to the Channel was an inexorable movement toward destiny. The train wheels seemed to repeat endlessly, D-Day calling. General Eisenhower's insistence on comprehensive preparation was paramount. It transformed abstract invasion plans into concrete lethal objectives. Soldiers were shown detailed maps, down to individual houses. They were thoroughly briefed on the German policy of treating captured paratroopers as spies. This policy was designed to instill a brutal, kill or be killed mentality. This preparation was briefly interrupted by a gale. The jump was called off, leading to an explosion of relief. However, this was followed by the immediate grim realization that the invasion could not be postponed. The strategic demands meant they were jumping tonight, wind or no wind. The final address came from Colonel Sink. He galvanized the men by framing the mission as the ultimate culmination of their training. He demanded 2 days and nights of violent effort, 2 days and nights of ceaseless savage fighting. He promised a brutal fight for a just cause. Colonel Sink declared, "This is a combat mission. Everybody jumps." He affirmed that nobody would go back to England. With the commander confidently predicting, "I feel mighty sorry for those Germans," the troops transformed their icy fumes of fear into a determined resolve. The transition to combat began in the hangar, a seething, dark hell. Men daubed camouflage grease paint, transforming themselves into Apache-faced savages. They loaded into the C-47s, the oppressive weight of their equipment musette bags, bayonets, trench knives, TNT, and parachutes added to the suffocating dread. The engines roared, a terrible, rattling, all-pervading roar, and the planes lifted off, circling the airfield. Below them, the invasion fleet stretched out, a flood of lava. It was composed of scores of landing barges, destroyers, and attack transports. This was a visual confirmation of the war's immense scale. The flight over the Channel was tense. The planes bucked and slammed in rough air currents. Then the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft fire, red dashes of tracer rounds and flak nests opened up below. One blast tilted a plane and forced the men to clamp their teeth shut. Death was no longer a philosophical concept. It was an immediate likelihood. As they approached the coast, the jumpmaster, Sergeant Graham, gave the final, inevitable command. "Stand up and hook up," he shouted, followed by "check your equipment." Despite the terror, men reported, "Okay." The lieutenant screamed, "Go." Webster was pushed out the door, plunging into the dark unknown. A fatal miscalculation by the Air Corps had dropped the paratroopers from a dangerously low 300 feet. They were far short of the intended drop zone. He descended into a flooded swamp, the cold black water rushing up to meet him. The enemy was waiting, opening fire with whip-like tracers and machine guns. The descent was instantly turned into a deadly lottery. Webster's initial fear was paralyzing. It was a primal realization that he was being hunted, prompting an existential questioning of the war's purpose. He landed in 3 feet of water, disoriented and struggling. The waterlogged compasses were useless, and equipment was discarded in the desperate push toward high ground. The relentless enemy fire cracked and popped around them. This was accompanied by the unsettling tolling of church bells that seemed to foretell death. Webster, unwilling to wait, pushed forward alone. He left behind Private William E. Ashe, who, injured and fatalistic, chose to remain. Ashe was subsequently killed. The brutal chaos of the jump and the subsequent fighting resulted in immense casualties. The 502 men lost on the causeway to Carentan underscored the horrific cost. 2 months and 22 days after D-Day, a formal memorial service was held. As 231 names were read, C-47s circled overhead. Their engines drowned out the general's speech, their wings dipping in a somber salute. The music of the death march cemented the profound grief and the irreversible alteration of the camaraderie forged by the Toccoa men. For Webster, the experience left a lasting psychological wound. It fostered a desire for detachment and questioning of personal connections. The war had irrevocably changed him, leaving the civilian world a distant, unthinkable memory. He had successfully transitioned from literary aspirant to combat veteran, paying a terrible price for his story. The infantry, the queen of battles, quickly asserted its grim primacy in Normandy. The war, Webster realized, was not won by technological superiority or aerial power. It was won by the common soldier taking and holding the ground. This was a brutal truth, often obscured by wartime mythology. A sudden, chaotic skirmish in Vierville vividly illustrated this reality. A quiet excursion to find cider quickly devolved into a brutal firefight when German paratroopers ambushed them. The spitting of M3 submachine guns ripped through the air in close-quarters combat. Captain Cox desperately battled a jammed weapon while the fighting raged. T4 Benjamin J. Stoney, a quiet, stocky man from S2, was killed. Sergeant Hoagie was wounded. The tide only shifted with the roar of Cromwell and Sherman tanks, ordered back by Colonel Strayer. This decisively ended the immediate threat. This savage action, where the German 6th Parachute Regiment lost 2/3 of its strength, left a deep psychological scar. It fostered in Webster a desire for detachment and a profound questioning of personal connections. This was a necessary defense mechanism against the constant, overwhelming grief of loss. The paratroopers were soon pulled from the hedgerows and hurled into Operation Market Garden. This was the largest airborne mission in history. Flying toward Holland, Webster observed the escorting P-47 and P-51 fighter planes. He grappled with his own mortality while contrasting the peaceful beauty of the sky with the impending danger. Before the jump, Colonel Sink provided a moment of dark humor. He warned the men about the British Cromwell tanks, calling them cheese boxes on a raft. He issued strict orders not to fire upon them. The jump itself was a dizzying arc into a hostile landscape. The air was immediately alive with shouting and the ominous sound of artillery fire. Coup rump, greeted them as they landed. The landing zone was immediately dangerous, despite being dotted with hundreds of spotted green parachutes. The dead lay in their chutes, a poignant image of their final descent. The initial objective was Zon, where they were to secure the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. But the plan immediately disintegrated. The village was deserted, and the 88mm guns signaled trouble. This was confirmed when they discovered the bridge had been blown, halting their advance instantly. The tactical failure underscored the vulnerability of airborne operations without adequate ground support or real-time intelligence. Despite the setback, the paratroopers eventually found a footbridge and pushed on. Their triumphal progress into Eindhoven was a brief, surreal moment of relief. The city, built around the giant Philips electrical plant, was filled with thousands of American paratroopers. Civilians cheered, clapped, and offered food and drink. Their gratitude was intense and sincere, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the combat they had just left. The advance into Noonan, however, quickly became a study in frustration. When Robert Marsh and Tom McCreary spotted a German medium tank and half-track, the American soldiers urged their British tank counterparts to engage. The British commanders refused. They cited orders not to destroy property in friendly territory. Marsh, furious at the perceived indecisiveness, spat, "Fucking limeys." He advocated for proceeding alone. The Americans were forced to press forward without adequate armor, exposed to German defenses and machine guns. As mortar fire began to fall, Webster shouted, "Mortars." He urged, "Let's get out of here." The intense and prolonged shelling by the dreaded 88mm guns, the whispering death, created an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Soldiers like Meth, the cook, were wounded and evacuated. This forced Sergeant William Guarnere into a brave rescue. The constant artillery fire, with shells landing in the next yard, created unbearable psychological stress. The initial advance failed, and the battalion attack was called off at twilight. This marked a tactical retreat and highlighted the friction and differing priorities that plagued Allied unity. News of the British 1st Airborne Division being ground to bloody rags by German panzers at Arnhem cast a long shadow. It signalled a strategic collapse that forced Webster's unit into a precarious, isolated defensive posture on the island. This island lay between the Wall and the Lower Rhine. Life on the island became a cycle of misery. Swollen, throbbing feet, soaking wet underclothing, and debilitating diarrhea were common. All these hardships contributed to an irritable, jaundiced outlook. Webster's grim definition of home became a hole in the mud, a bedroll in a haystack, or a night in a wet ditch lined with dead men. The constant strain was punctuated by sudden, violent alarms. The Germans were known to be dug in behind a windmill, silently observing. A frantic alert one day signalled a breakthrough. "The Krauts have broken through," the message screamed. A desperate counterattack was launched across an open field under heavy artillery fire. This flat stretch offered no cover. Amidst the chaos of the charge, friendly artillery began to fire on their own position. Panic erupted as soldiers desperately shouted to cease fire. They feared they would all be killed. In the resulting confusion, a machine gunner named Dukeman was killed by the very forces meant to protect him. It was in this maelstrom of friendly fire and German shelling that Webster felt a sharp, searing pain. A spike pierced his leg. He immediately composed its description in his mind. He recognized it as a $1 million wound, not severe enough to be permanently debilitating, but sufficient to extract him from the front lines. His heart pounded like a machine gun as he began a desperate escape across the open fields. He was determined not to linger. He refused the medic's help, focused only on reaching the aid station. This injury, an extraction from the chaos, became a profound personal turning point. It allowed him to step back and chronicle the war while reinforcing his commitment to the unit he knew he would eventually rejoin. The truck ride back to the front lines in February 1945 was a grim re-immersion into the war. Webster had briefly escaped the conflict. 8 months after D-Day, the journey to Alsace was defined by a visceral hatred for Europe. The continent had become synonymous with mud, death, and grinding misery. His destination, Haguenau, was not a town but a ruin. Gutted white houses grinned with black shell holes like skulls. Rubble was bulldozed against their foundations. The cobblestone roads were pocked with shell craters. The constant artillery fire, sometimes 800 shells a day, sounded like heavy rain. Tremendous booms were punctuated by the whispering of incoming rounds. The reunion at the company command post was a stark lesson in the war's attrition. Webster encountered Sergeant Mann and the new company commander, Captain Spares. Spares was described as reckless, savage, but possessed an honest and sincere smile. This hinted at a brutal, pragmatic leadership style. The real lesson lay in the voids. The 3rd Battalion, which had left Moormelon with over 500 men just weeks earlier, was now reduced to about 150. Webster's friends, McCreary and Marsh, expressed disbelief and relief at seeing him alive, but the grim humour of their shared survival could not mask the profound loss. The normalization of this extreme violence was absolute. Even the death of close friends had become a numbing part of the routine. The unit settled into outpost duty. This involved constant, gnawing anxiety made worse by the squalor of their positions. Their dwelling was a dilapidated house. Its walls were riddled with bullet holes, its hallway a garbage dump. They huddled around a tile stove, the air lit by a gurgling kerosene lamp. They stared at walls pocked with shrapnel and sheets stained with blood. Their immediate front line was the 15-yard-wide Modder River. The enemy was only 150 yards north, a constant, unseen threat. In the midst of this squalor, the soldiers sought solace in bitter honesty. McCreary, the cynical companion, provided a raw, unvarnished account of the 101st Airborne's experience at Bastogne. This account violently rejected the heroic narrative peddled by publications like Stars and Stripes. McCreary described the brutal reality of being surrounded. He spoke of the desperate lack of supplies and the heavy casualties incurred even after the 4th Armoured broke through. The official story of a triumphant, clean victory was a lie. The reality was desperation, freezing terror, and a unit that had been decimated. This profound disconnect between propaganda and the truth was the daily currency of the frontline soldier. The constant tension bred psychological trauma. During the long, dark nights, the men were unnerved by the mysterious ghost wagon. They could hear its approach. It was the ungreased grating of dry wood on dry wood, the horses neighing and the harness jingle. They could hear the crunching in the snow as it moved through the German houses to their left. They couldn't see it or hit it. The legend grew that this silent spectre of death had followed them across Europe. It was a manifestation of their shared, unending paranoia. Finally, the order came for a dangerous patrol across the Modder River. The goal was to secure prisoners and intelligence. Armed with Thompson's, rifle grenades and fragmentation grenades, they moved out. The silence of the night was shattered by the sudden burst of a flare. The moment the patrol reached its objective, the entire battlefield erupted. Artillery barrages, 60s and 81s belching flame, 75s and 105s lighting up the western ridges transformed the landscape into a volcanic hell. An 18-8 shell buzzed over them like an angry bee. It smashed into the D Company dugout nearby. In the aftermath, the patrol secured its objective, a burning house that stood out like an angel in hell. They also found a wounded German prisoner